Welcome to the Flash Essential Training Series. I'm Mike, your host. And in this tutorial, we'll be talking about working with events in ActionScript 3, and this is going to be MouseEvents Part 2. So continuing where we left off from the last tutorial, we will continue to explore the MouseEvents in ActionScript 3. If you remember, the last event that we discussed was handling the mouse over and mouse out events of our demonstration. These are very useful events in ActionScript, but there was one area that I did not fully cover about these events. When the mouse cursor passes over an interactive object inside a Flash, several events are fired to the event dispatcher. The mouse over and mouse out events are dispatched when the user passes over the mouse pointer over and then out of any interactive object. This occurs even if that object is a child of the previous one. The rollover and rollout event has been added to ActionScript 3 to make it a little easier for the developer to write interactivity to interactive objects that have children. These will fire only for an interactive object if the mouse pointer has moved to or from an object that is not one of its descendants. This may sound a little confusing right now, but it's a much better practice and actually a best practice to use the rollover and the rollout events for these particular actions. We will look at that as we move through this tutorial. The first thing we will demonstrate is the DoubleClick event. This event does not function as one might guess, so let's look a little closer at that event. So let's go ahead and drop into our development environment and work through some exercises. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. Let's get into our development environment. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Flash. You'll notice I've got my branding screen loaded, and the first thing I want to do, let's go ahead and do Save As. We're going to save this as our work file for the 1009 exercise. So I'm going to save it as _1 so we don't make any changes to our start file. And in this tutorial, we're going to discuss MouseEvents, and this is part 2 of the series. So let's look at some of the features of the MouseEvents that may not be so obvious to the developer. If you remember from the last tutorial, we had a mouse over and a mouse out event tied to 2 of our buttons. We want to build on that knowledge as well as how to properly utilize the DoubleClick feature in ActionScript 3. These work a little differently than merely adding the event to the event listener. So first thing, let's handle a DoubleClick event. We're going to be covering a lot of new concepts in this tutorial. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, just go ahead and use that link above the tutorial to go ahead and email me and ask me any questions that you may have. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, as we always do, I'm going to go ahead and open up my actions layer. That's F9 in Windows or Option F9 in the Mac. I'm going to kind of move this over to our side like we've been keeping it. And the first thing I'm going to do is let's go ahead and hit a stop as the first line of code in our actions layer. Oops. Take that back. We didn't add an actions layer. So the first thing I want to do, let's go ahead and add a layer to our timeline. Let's name that layer actions. Let's go ahead and select frame 1 of the actions layer. I'm going to go ahead and lock it. And now we're going to go ahead and open up our actions panel, F9 in Windows or Option F9 in the Mac. And let's add that stop function to our actions panel. See, even I can goof up. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to add a function. And in this function, I'm going to call this function ClickTest. I'm going to go use my camel case as we always do. I'm going to go ahead and put my opening and closing parentheses, my semicolon I'm going to void because I'm not expecting a return, my opening curly brace and closing curly brace. We're going to put a lot of code inside this function, stuff that you haven't seen in the past, and we'll talk about it once I get everything in. So the first thing I'm going to do is I want to create a variable called circle. I'm going to put my colon and data type that as a sprite. And you'll notice again, Flash is importing those display sprites into our ActionScript. This is going to be equal to a new sprite. This is actually a class in ActionScript 3. So we're actually this is going to be equal to a new sprite. Now I'm going to say circle dot, because now we're actually going to get into the properties of the circle itself. I'm going to go into the graphics, dot line style, and I'm going to open a parentheses, and I want to put down 1, 0x 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So I've got 6 zeros there. And what that is, that's the hexadecimal value of the color black. And I'm going to end that with a semicolon. And again, I'll talk through this code once we get through entering it. I want to go with my circle again. So I'm going to type circle dot graphics dot begin fill and again, another class inside of ActionScript. I'm going to open my parentheses, and I'm going to have 0x, and again, we're going to put in a hexadecimal value, FFFF00. I'm going to close my parentheses and end that with a semicolon. That's actually going to be a yellow fill color. That's a hexadecimal value for yellow. Then again, I'm going to do circle, dot, graphics, dot, draw a circle. So again, we're calling another class inside of ActionScript. And in my parentheses, I'm going to have 100, comma, 150, comma, 30. Close the parentheses and end that with a semicolon. Come down below that to circle, dot, graphics. And again, I'll explain all this stuff as we get into after we enter all our code. I'm going to say end fill, open and close my parentheses, and end that with a semicolon. And then I'm going to use what's called the add child method. So add child, inside parentheses, I'm going to say circle. End that with a semicolon. Let me go ahead and scroll up a little bit. Come outside we're not done yet, but this would be a great time for you to pause if you want to go ahead and catch up where we're at. All right, after the add child, I want to go ahead and say circle. So I'm coming down to the next line, say circle dot add event listener. Finally, something that you're familiar with. So I'm adding an event listener to my circle, and inside my parentheses, I'm going to be listening for a mouse event. Dot click. I'm going to put my comma and the function. Actually, remember, that should all be in capital letters. That click should all be capitalized. Then I'm going to put a comma, and the function I want to call is going to be an onClick function. Then I'm going to close out my parentheses and end that with a semicolon. And right below that line, I'm going to say circle again. Dot add event listener. Open my parentheses, again, mouse event. Dot, this time we're listening for, let me go fix that. This time we're actually listening for a double click. So in capital letters, double, underscore click, comma, and then the function we're going to call when that occurs is on DClick. So it's basically on double click. Close my parentheses, end that with a semicolon. I'm going to come down and pull out that blank line. Another good time for you to pause if you want to go ahead and catch up where we're at. And then right below that, I'm actually going to call that function. I'm not ready to run it yet, but I want to go ahead and call it, open and close my parentheses, and end it with a semicolon. Now I actually have to write the two functions that we called inside our event listeners. So let's come down below that click test where we actually called the function, or the click test function that we created. And let's create a function. And this function is called onClick. Remember, it's the one that we're calling with that first add event listener when we're listening for the click. And again, I'm going to be listening for an EVT, mouse event. And remember, we talked about that EVT could be anything you want it to be. I just happen to use EVT because to me it signifies an event. I want my colon and void because I'm not going to have any return. My opening and closing curly braces, and I want to trace to the output panel. Inside parentheses, inside quotation marks, you clicked once. I'm going to end that with the quotation mark, close parentheses, end that with a semicolon. So that's the first function that we're going to call. Now I want to come down. I'll give you a pause in a second here. Let's create another function. This one's going to be on DClick. Remember, that's the second function that we called inside that on event listener. Again, I'm going to listen for an EVT, colon, mouse event. Close my parentheses. I'm going to void this out because, again, we're not expecting a return. Open my curly brace, close my curly brace, and I'm going to trace to the output panel. You double clicked. Close my quotation marks, close the parenthesis, and that with a semicolon. Let's go ahead and, oops, I forgot to put that in quotation marks. Remember, whenever we're tracing strings to our output panel, they've always got to be enclosed in quotation marks. And actually, whenever we're working with strings at all, in most any programming language, they have to be enclosed in quotation marks. Let's go ahead and save all those changes to our code. Now would be a good time to pause if you need to go ahead and catch up with where we're at. So there's a lot of new code in this example. Let me scroll back up so we can talk through what we've done here. First, we used a standard stop function, as we've been doing throughout our tutorials, that stops the timeline from moving forward. It's not needed right now because I don't have any extra frames, and I just want you to get used to the habit of putting that in your ActionScript. Because when we get to tutorials where we're going to have multiple frames, you're going to want to stop this to perform certain functions on frames, and I want you to get used to using that stop function. Next, we created what's called a click test. That's the function, the very first function that we created. This function, constructed like many of the functions that we have been dealing with since we began the function tutorials in ActionScript, but we've begun a new process in ActionScript, and that is creating from code objects on the stage. We're actually going to dynamically create a circle on our stage with this code. You'll begin to see me do this quite often as we move forward in the tutorials. Creating objects from code increases the speed of our files and also allows you to add and remove items from the stage in the development of the code itself. This saves time, it saves memory in your CPU, and it saves processing power as your application executes. So it's a lot quicker to actually generate this stuff dynamically than it is to just pull symbols onto our stage. Sometimes we'll have to, because you're not going to be able to create everything you want to create in code. But when you're dealing with just generic basic symbols, it's a lot quicker to generate them in code. In the function, we declared the variable circle as a new sprite. We haven't talked about sprite yet, but we will. It's coming up in a future tutorial. A sprite is a new object in ActionScript 3, and there's not an equivalent in the interface design environment yet. It's basically a movie clip without a timeline. Since it does not include all that is part of the timeline, it's much smaller in memory weight and programs very effectively. We'll spend much more time on sprites in future tutorials. I just want you to see another new feature in ActionScript 3. The next 4 lines of code create the graphic for the stage. The add child element adds the graphic for display to the display list so that it can be actually seen on the stage. In a future tutorial, we'll discuss the hierarchy, parents and children in ActionScript 3 in much more detail, but that's how that add child event actually adds that, or the add child method actually adds that to the stage itself. Without that, we wouldn't be able to see it. It wouldn't appear. Then we've added 2 event listeners to our function, listening for the click and the double click event in our object. Then I called the function, and you should be pretty used to that by now. Let me scroll down a little bit. Then I called the actual click test function. Goodness gracious, having trouble with that today. Go ahead and save that change because I actually spelled it wrong. So I've called the function. Without calling it, as we've talked about in the past, it won't execute. So remember that from all our function tutorials. We've got to actually call that function before it can actually execute. Then we wrote the standard functions for our click and our double click. So what I want to do now, let's go ahead and test this movie. Control it on Windows, Command Return on the Mac. And you'll notice now we've got a nice little yellow circle on our stage. If I click on it, you'll notice I got it clicked once. Let me double click. You'll notice I clicked once. So it's not detecting our double click. The double click doesn't work. And that's why I wanted to point out an important programming concept for ActionScript 3. Double click must be invoked for any item in ActionScript 3 by adding that property to the item. And that's what we're going to look at next. All right, so we know we can click on the item and we're getting that call to the function, but when I double click, all I'm seeing is you clicked once. So let's go ahead and close this movie out. I'm going to go ahead and minimize that output panel. This issue drove me crazy for the first couple hours one afternoon when I was first working with ActionScript 3. I tried and just could not figure it out, and I couldn't find it documented anywhere. I eventually did figure this out. So let's go back into our actions. I'm going to select frame 1 of that actions layer. I'm going to open up my actions panel, F9 in Windows, Option F9 in Mac. And inside the function, let's add the following code. So I'm going to go back inside our function. Right after we add that circle to the stage with the add child, I'm going to go back and add an event to our code. So I'm going to say circle dot double click enabled. And then I'm going to say equal true. And I'm going to end that with a semicolon. So that's the line of code right there that I just entered into that initial function. That's our test function. Remember the click test function that we created earlier? Right below where I added the child to the stage, I added another line of code. I'm going to do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as _2. So So you've got to have that double click enabled property set to true in order for an item to recognize the double click. Notice that I added this code after I placed the circle on the stage by using the add-child method. It has to be after it appears on the stage in order for it to work. So let's go ahead and test this movie. I'm going to do a Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. I'm going to click, we get our single click, and if I double click, now you'll notice you see the double click. It's actually detecting now that double click, but also notice when I double click, it says you clicked once. It's detecting the very first click, and then it's detecting that double click. So that's an important aspect. Notice now that the double click worked, but there's something that you need to be aware of. When you double click the object, you'll notice that the event dispatcher fires a single click, then the double click. If you have an event listener listening for a click on that object, when it's double clicked, both those functions will fire. Most times this will not make a difference, but there are instances when developing your applications that these two functions firing could give you unexpected results. So just be aware that currently with the double click flash is firing both the click and the double click function. So let's change our demonstration a little bit to reflect a change in the code when we roll over the circle with the mouse. I'm going to go ahead and close this movie, and we're going to do another demonstration. All right, so I want to make sure I've selected frame 1 of my actions layer, because again, we're going to be in the actions panel. And inside the function, let's go ahead and modify this a little bit. I'm going to modify our function, and I'm going to change this to overtest. So I'm just going to modify the function we already have so we don't have to keep typing all this code over and over again. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's go ahead and save this as work file 3_3. So we've changed our function to overtest, and I want to add a couple other event listeners to this. So I'm going to come down below where we have our event listener listening for the double click, and I'm going to say circle, add event listener. And this event listener, I'm going to be listening for a mouse over event. So again, just like before, it's a mouse event. And then I put my dot, and this time it's going to be a roll over. So roll_over, all in caps. And I want to run a new function called onOver. And then with a parentheses, and then it with a semicolon. So I've got my mouse event dot rollover, all in caps, with the underscore between the roll and the over, comma onOver. That's the function that's going to run. I want to add one more. So I'm going to say circle dot add event listener. And again, we're listening for a mouse event. That happens to be the area that we're in right now. And this is going to be a roll out, ROLL_OUT, all caps. And this time I want to listen for an on, or I'm going to fire an on out function when it detects that rollout of our function. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes. Let me go ahead and scroll down a little bit. This is a good time for you to catch up if you need to make those changes to the name of the function and add those two event listeners. All right, now I'm going to change our function call, obviously, because we don't have the click test anymore. I want to change this to overtest. And then we need to go ahead and create those two functions that we just talked about. So I'm going to come down below our functions that we've created earlier, and I'm going to add another function. This function is going to be called onOver. And in this function, again, EVT, that's the variable that I'm giving the actual mouse event we're listening for. We're going to be listening for a mouse event. Close my quotation, or close my parentheses. Again, colon void, not expecting any returns from this function. And I want to trace to my output panel, open my parentheses, in quotation marks, you have rolled over the circle. Close my quotation marks, close my parentheses, and end that with a semicolon. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy this function, Control-C on the PC, Command-C on the Mac, come down right below that function. Let's paste the next one in because we're actually going to have an on-out function also. So let's go ahead and change the name of that function to on-out. And again, EVT listening for a mouse event, no expected return, so I've got void for the data type. And I'm just going to say here, you've rolled out of the circle. Let me go ahead and scroll up. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and catch up where we're at. Let's go ahead and save those changes to the code that we've made for this particular exercise. So let's talk about what we've done. You'll notice now when we test our movie that we've added additional functionality to our example. We've configured 4 events to operate off our function. It should be noted that using the rollover and the rollout methods are the best practice way of addressing these functions. So let's go ahead and test this movie, and we'll talk a little more about this as we test. Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Macs. Now when I roll out or roll over, you'll see we've rolled over the circle. I roll out, we've rolled out of the circle. I can now double click, single click, double click. But I've got 4 different functions now that are occurring with this circle as we perform this exercise. So there's a lot of different things now that we're doing here. The mouse over and mouse out may have, depending upon how you're coding, issues addressing children within the movie clip. These issues will not occur using the rollover and the rollout. And these will be the methods that we're going to use throughout the remaining tutorials. Rolling over and rolling out is the best method to use. It's the best practice method to use for this particular type of demonstration. I want to demonstrate one more thing before we close out the tutorial. So let's go ahead and save all these changes. I'm going to go ahead and close my output panel. Let's go ahead and close this movie. All right, so we're going to get a little complex again because I want to keep pushing you. I want you to understand all the power that we have. I'm going to go ahead and select frame 1 of that actions layer. I'm going to open up the actions panel. I've already got it opened on our stage in case you don't. It's F9 in Windows or Option F9 in the Mac. Right above, let's go scroll all the way back up to the top here, and right above our function, our over test function, I want to create a variable. And I want that variable to be called circle. Because remember, the circle that we're creating inside the function is only available in the function. Remember, we talked about scope in earlier tutorials. So let's go ahead and create a variable called circle. I want to data type that as a sprite. I want it to be equal to a new sprite. Open and close, or no, just end that with a semicolon. Don't need any parentheses there. So I've created a variable called circle. I've data typed it as a sprite, and it's equal to a new sprite. And that's a class inside of ActionScript. Now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and take this variable that we have inside of our function, and I'm just going to rev it out. I'm going to put 2 forward slashes there. That becomes a remark now. It's no longer going to be executed in our code. This is just so that you have it available. And now what I want to do is I want to come down and create another function. So below our over test function, I'm going to add a couple lines. I want to create a new function, and I want that function to be called modify circle. And here, I'm actually going to have a color, UINT, is what I'm going to pass into this function. So I'm going to actually pass a value into this function. I'm going to data type this as void, opening and closing my curly braces. And now inside the function, the first thing I want to do, let's take our circle. That's the variable that we created. Graphics clear. So I got graphics.clear, opening and closing parentheses, and then that with a semicolon. And we'll talk about this when we complete. So let's, again, with our circle, we're going to go to another property, graphics.lineStyle. Open my parentheses. I'm going to have 1, comma, 0x, and then 6 zeros. Close my parentheses and end that with a semicolon. So again, we're adding that black line to our circle. Circle dot graphics begin fill. Very similar to what we had done before. Open my parentheses, and I'm going to say color. Close my parentheses, and that with a semicolon. Now keep in mind, color is the variable that we declared when we began our function. That's what we're sending into it. So we're actually going to send the color in through a variable to create the color for this particular fill. Then I'm going to say circle dot graphics draw circle. So graphics dot draw circle. Open my parentheses. I'm going to have 75, comma, 75, comma, 55. Close my parentheses, and then that with a semicolon. And then circle dot graphics end fill. open and close parentheses, and end that with a semicolon. So we've added a brand new function now to this test. Let me go ahead and scroll up a little bit. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and catch up where we're at with this particular function. All right, now what I want to do is I want to come down. Remember where we had that graph or the function on over with our EVT mouse event? I want you to change what's going to occur when that function is fired, when it's triggered. So I want you to type modify circle open and close parentheses 0x ff00ff. I'm actually putting in a color now that's going to occur when I go over the circle. So it's going to modify the color. And the same thing with our on out. I want to go ahead and pull out the trace statement. Modify circle, open your parentheses, 0x ff00ff. Close the parentheses and end it with a semicolon. So now when I come out of the circle, when I move the mouse over, it's going to trigger the modify circle function. When I move the mouse out, it's going to trigger the modify circle function. Let's go ahead and save these changes. I'm going to save these as 1009_4 inside the exercise file. So again, what we're doing with these two functions now is we're actually calling this function. We're calling another function from inside of ActionScript, and we're passing this function inside this variable. We're passing them this color. Because remember, when we call the function, we can send it an argument. We're actually sending it the argument for that color. And you're going to see this in 1 minute. So let's go test our movie, Control Enter on Windows or Command Return in the Mac. We've got our circle on the stage. When I pass over it, look what happened. We actually had some interaction when we passed over that circle for our ActionScript. Again, let me test that movie one more time. We pass over it. Boom, it's changed the color. It's moved the circle, triggering this particular function. So that modify circle function that we created could have been instructed to do most anything with our object on our stage. The concept of how important functions are in the development of our code cannot be overemphasized. That's where the power of programming is in these functions and how we use them. Keep in mind that both our roll over and roll out called the same function. They did not have to, but that's the way I just happened to set up the demonstration. Again, we could reuse the code over and over again. They could call different functions, but what you're seeing here is you're seeing a function actually calling another function as it performed that mouse event. And again, very important concept in programming. So we could have multiple functions actually inside this function that are being called whenever this event occurs, whatever event that happens to be. And as we work through more and more exercises inside ActionScript, you're going to see just how powerful this becomes. One thing you'll notice about my tutorials, as I was actually going through and producing this video, I noticed there was something that I didn't explain well. And I do this a lot. When I'm actually producing the video, I try to look at it as if I know nothing about what's going on, and then see if I would understand everything that occurred. One thing I noticed is when I actually put this draw circle function inside of our modify circle function, I didn't really explain to you what those parameters were, and I want to do that now. We actually put in a 75, comma, 75, and then comma, 55. And what these are, this is the X position, the Y position, and the radius of that circle that we're drawing. That's what those three parameters are. And actually, if you look as we started to type them in, you'll notice that when I put that first parentheses there and started typing, I actually got a code hint that told me that's the X number, the Y number, and the radius of the actual circle. And I wanted you to understand that because you can actually position these anywhere you want them on your stage. And that's what we're doing with these numbers. We're actually positioning the actual circle where it is X and Y on the stage, and then the last value is the radius of the circle, actually how big it is. And in our example, we use 55. And again, as I was going and producing the video, I noticed I hadn't explained that well, and I wanted you to understand how that's being positioned. And to give you something to think about, because actually if you went in to that second function that we created on out, you could actually create another function that not only changed the color, but you could actually move that circle when you roll out of it. Be careful you don't get caught up in an endless loop, because I mean, if you're rolling in and out constantly, you could actually get the program in a loop. But again, I'm trying to explain things as we go along, and I wanted you to understand what these numbers were. As I was producing the video, I didn't make that very clear, and I wanted to clear it up. So I hope that clears up what some of the parameters are inside this draw circle function inside of ActionScript. And again, as we go through future tutorials, we'll get more and more into how we do these things dynamically. I do want to add one thing to this, because I noticed as I was going through the demonstration that I actually have the on out and the on over doing the exact same thing. So there's not a real good indication. If you look at the code and we test the movie, there's not a real good indication that anything's even occurring on the on out. So real quick, let's go ahead and change the on out to just give it a different color. So I'm just going to take those last two F's that I had on the on out function and change those to 2 zeros. Let's go ahead and do a save as. I'm going to save this as exercise file 5_5 for this particular demonstration. Let's go ahead and test our movie again. Control Enter in Windows, Command Return in the Mac. Now when I roll in, you'll notice the circle change, but when I come out of it, you'll notice it's actually changing the color. So we're actually performing two different functions instead of the same function when I go over and in. And again, can't overemphasize how powerful functions are and the things that we can do dynamically in ActionScript once we get a good grasp on how to use these in our programming. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our development environment. Let's go back into our presentation and let's review what we've talked about in this tutorial. So inside part 2 of the MouseEvents, we covered many new things in the tutorial. We looked at adding sprites to our stage dynamically using code instead of actually dragging symbols onto the stage. We looked at the graphics.line style, the graphics.begin_fill, the graphics.drawCircle, the graphics.endFill, and the add child event, which actually brings that graphic that we created onto our stage. And by the way, there's a lot more of these that we can do. You'll see a lot more of these as we move through the tutorial, but there's a lot of things that we can do in ActionScript 3 dynamically while we're actually working with our code. We also discussed the DoubleClick event and some of the unique characteristics of DoubleClick inside ActionScript. And again, don't forget that when we fire the DoubleClick, we're also firing off the click. So you want to make certain that those functions don't counteract one another. You got to be very, very careful when you're programming a DoubleClick event inside ActionScript 3. Just have a good understanding of what's occurring with those events. We looked at the DoubleClick enabled property, that you actually have to have that property on a sprite or a symbol to enable DoubleClick to work for that particular property in ActionScript 3. We assigned multiple event listeners to a function. You actually saw this time where we actually had 4 different event listeners inside our same function that were being triggered based on different things that were occurring with the code. We looked at the rollover event, the rollout event. We demonstrated local and global variables once again using our sprite. Remember when we created the circle the first time, we used a local variable inside the function. Towards the end of the exercise, we actually created that circle as a global variable before our function, had the function set the variable up, and then we called it outside the function. And we demonstrated calling a function from within a function. Actually having a function that's triggered by an event, call another function. Again, very, very powerful feature of any programming language, but especially ActionScript 3, since that's what we're studying. But you can do that with all programming languages, and it adds a tremendous amount of power once you understand how they can work together. So in the next tutorial, we'll continue our discussion on MouseEvents, because we're still not done, by building a power tip. MouseEvents in ActionScript 3 Part 3 is next. I hope you have any comments or suggestions on the tutorial. Please let me know. There's an email link right above this video, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.